بهره برداری امن از موبایل و اینترنت، زن، حقوق فردی و اجتماعی، سازوکارهای جلوگیری از نقض حقوق بشر، پویشی در مفهوم دموکراسی، مروری بر پایگیری نهادهای مدنی در ایران، اندیشه‌های نوین از حقوق کارگران، آموزش خبرنگاری، حقوق شهروندی امروز و محیط زیست. توانا، رایگان توانایی ما را به سمت انسان امروزین جهانی متمدن تازه می کند. برای شرکت در این کلاس ها به توانا.org بروید و با جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. از طریق فیسبوک، توییتر و شبکه یوتیوب می توانید آموزشکده توانا را دنبال کنید. توانا آموزشکده است برای جامعه مدنی ایران.
My name is Amelia Andersdotter. I'm a member of the European Parliament.
Amelia?
Amelia Andersdotter. I'm a member of the European Parliament on behalf of the Swedish Payret Party. So I work in Brussels and in Strasbourg, and I represent technically both the Payret Party and Sweden, but like formally the Swedish electorate. So this is a very difficult question, actually. One of the things because in the European Parliament I've been working a lot with industry issues, and I think a really tangible threat to internet freedom is that we very much try to put the regulatory focus in the wrong places. When we have an internet infrastructure and the service provision and the online service platforms that users are interacting with to empower themselves every day and form their cultural... I mean, we have the acknowledgement that the internet helps you shape your cultural identity. It helps you shape an identity at large. It helps us form communities and social companionship with other human beings across borders. It helps us overthrow governments when the social cohesion is large enough. But the infrastructure is largely private, and we have in the discussion on industry regulation, the notion of these social concept is completely lacking. And I think this is actually a threat to internet freedom that is not often discussed, because normally you would hear, especially from industry of course, that the best way of preserving freedom and entrepreneurship is by not regulating anything. I don't think it is as simple as that, and really big challenge for society and the citizens that are using information and communication technologies to empower themselves will be to take on this challenge and see, like, maybe we need to politicize some of the debates about these private actors and stakeholders, and make sure that also society gets a larger say. And if, to the extent that some of our top leaders of the world that really fight for human rights in the online environment are serious about their ambitions, they also will need to eventually acknowledge that this means having a social aspect and this human rights aspect incorporated in industry regulation as well, because actually we cannot do it any other way. It doesn't make sense to have a human rights declaration which is only applicable in a space over which the government and the nation state has very little jurisdiction. So this would be maybe like the biggest challenge. How do we get jurisdiction to have this social interaction space? Okay, so I work in the International Trades Committee and the Industry Committee and in the Budget Control Committee. Technically, I have the full membership in the Industry Committee, so this is where the vast majority of my work is performed now. And I've been working lots with digital markets regulation. In the past, I've been looking quite a lot also at competition in the telecommunications sector. And of course, this spring, so you cannot avoid this, but ACTA has been the number one issue, I think, for the entire institution, regardless of who you are in the parliament. You will have gotten in touch with this issue at some point, whether through a citizen or through a lobbyist or however. So this has been a really big kind of work task this spring. Well, I mean, I would hope that I'm trying to help those people in many cases. So there's different layers of help, of course. Like, one of the types of help that you can be is like actively show your support maybe participate in demonstrations, be where the citizens are as a group. The other thing is maybe also helping people get in touch with institutions when contact needs to be made. And this is something I work with both these things. Also explaining what is a relevant way of interpreting my work, and what is a relevant way, what are relevant things to ask from me, for instance. So over this entire spring in Sweden, because of course this is after all my constituency somehow, I've had this kind of project where I try to talk about the tools that parliamentarians can use in their day-to-day work. I had one voter who asked me, why is it that you don't make enough written questions, actually? And I told him that there was nothing that I wanted to know, so I didn't make a written question to the commission because I had nothing to ask. And he said, but listen, your wage is very high, you need to have a written question that you need to ask. And I said, maybe I will have, but it will take some time for me to develop this. And actually they cost already 12.5 million euros per year to answer, and most of the written questions are not so useful. And I thought maybe I would save mine up for when there was something worthwhile asking. And then I've been doing that also. And I think this would be really helpful if citizens knew what pressure to apply on their public representatives. Their public representatives would, by definition, do a better job. Currently, we have MEPs that ask written questions once every couple of days, and they're really not very useful questions, but it looks good in the statistics, and in the election campaign in 2014, it will look like they were very active. So what kind of really irks me about the surveillance tool discussion is that on the one hand, our governments in Europe want to apply very strict control over our communications, and we have several governments in Europe that aren't very happy about Tor, for instance. But the Swedish government, which technically isn't very happy about Tor when it's used by our citizens, are sponsoring the development of the Tor project so that it can be used for citizen journalism in countries where citizen journalism is badly needed to keep the system in check. So here I would want for the European governments to apply less double standards. And this is a really big problem, that we define internet freedom and digital rights as something that is very useful when it kind of gets rid of people elsewhere, but we don't see it as anything that could be used to encourage or incite a democratic debate in Europe. On the contrary, the Parliament reaction and the Commission reaction in particular to the ACTA discussions, which have been online, offline, all over Europe at the same time. When has this ever happened before in the entire history of the European Union, actually? And then we're seeing that as a huge inconvenience where the citizens are kind of attacking the institutions and not being very clever. So a bit more consistency here would be very nice. And at the same time, I see, of course, the difficulty also with regulating exports this way. Many of the items that are being exported by Nokia Siemens, for instance, there was this big scandal a few years ago before they made their corporate responsibility schemes. And I mean, on the one hand, the German and the Finnish economies are living from these exports, so it's difficult to kind of stop them from exporting when there is a consumer market from which they can profit. On the other hand, the exporters clearly can lead to very immoral reactions.
Yeah, of course. You know.
Yes. Well, yeah. So I think one of the most interesting example of telecommunications being used in riots actually is something I heard from Nigeria many years ago. Like, well, I mean, not decades, but say 4 or 5, 6 years ago, when text messages were used as a way of mobilizing a demonstration around a particular cause in Nigeria. Now, the problem with the social media platforms that we have online is that actually, again, European jurisdictions and the American jurisdiction also have all of these specialized rules which kind of force upon big providers like Twitter and Google and Yahoo to make geographically restricted domains. So in Germany, for instance, you cannot talk too much about the Nazis because this is not good according to the government. So Twitter has actually a specific Germany policy that prohibits the speech about well, I think technically it's denial of the Holocaust. So you're not allowed to deny the Holocaust on German Twitter. It just gets removed. And the fact that we are applying these measures here makes also it legitimate for other governments to apply that type of norm inside of their geographical jurisdiction. And because we are so forceful and righteous about applying those restrictions here, all of the providers will already basically have put the infrastructure for achieving these geographical divisions in place. And this is a really big problem where I would hope that European governments were able to, in the future, exercise more caution and good judgment. In general, I think when people want to change, when people want to change in society though, and when this is a really strong need for a change, isn't it so that people will use the means they have at hand? And using those means can be more or less painful for the people. In Syria, we're obviously seeing a lot of pain right now when people are using whatever means available actually to protest whichever way they want. And the social media in Tunisia and Egypt, for instance, those events may have actually made the transition process less painful than it otherwise would have been. And then in the future, we will see if now the compartmentalization of the online environment will maybe make people use different tools instead. I don't think the age of revolts is probably not over, but having social media and kind of information and companionship this way as a tool for a revolution, at least I find more appealing than the idea of returning to pitchforks. So it's very difficult to say. We make resolutions, of course, and I've been very mindful. Well, so I didn't work in the Parliament for a long time, but I would be very mindful in my work of trying to include also in our international trade provisions and in our international relations in general, protection for people's access to knowledge and protection for people's right to education, which in many jurisdictions today is very, very bad, actually. So this is something that I would be mindful of as a kind of general strategy. The international trade framework that the European Union is currently setting up with respect to third parties has a huge impact on the way that people are allowed to make online commerce or e-services or access to educational material online or texts or books or braille translated scripts or whatever. So this is a real area where we need some kind of improvement, because very often countries that are located outside of Europe, maybe where the institutional frameworks are weaker, are not able to absorb the trade agreements in the way that we would, essentially, because we have the institutions in place already for implementing a trade agreement in a whatever, like fundamental rights safe way. And here the European Commission, and in particular DG Trade, should really take more care about this. And there's already strong international pressure on this for many, many years. It's not particularly controversial for them to make this shift. And I'm hoping that maybe this is one of the small areas of progress that we could see happening over the next couple of years, and especially in light of the ACTA debate, it would be very good if this new perspective could be brought into international trade, where it's very badly needed. So optimally, when you have a new kind of society tool where lots of people participate and interact, you would allow that space to kind of develop on its own a bit, like the social norms that will apply, and the kind of, especially with citizen interactions. So like there's many layers, of course. You have government interests and then commercial interests, and then you have the citizen interests. But how citizens choose to interact with each other, whether or not they do it over Twitter or what they say to each other, how they talk with each other, isn't this something we can technically leave to citizens? I think this was very well addressed in the last panel. What do you do actually when your amulet in Buntas was taken away? This is not an obvious question to answer, but I'm reasonably sure that in due course we will find ways of discussing that. It's not maybe technically related to the clean internet, but that's because that's just a very bizarre discussion to have. I mean, they're not talking about the clean internet, they're talking about keeping the brains of their citizens clean. And this, of course, you can also discuss, but in China, that problem goes beyond the internet. This is also a problem of their newspapers, of their books, of their songs, and like everything in the Chinese environment is about being somehow spiritually and mentally clean of external political influence. And this clearly isn't a good situation. That is not a way to build a society.
internet
I think it
specifically?
depends. It will very much depend on whether or not the European institutions, I think that I would like to believe that the European institutions and the European Union can play a very important role in defining the future. But it will very much depend on how we react to the very spectacular united protests that we've had this spring, where citizens say, hey, listen, you're going in the wrong direction, we don't like this, actually stop. And how will we as regulators and legislators internalize this and make a change in the way that we do policy? Clearly, citizens feel personally affected by the way that we regulate industry. This should tell us that we need to keep that into account when we regulate also industry. And maybe we will see a shift. And I think technically the debate is not going in the entirely wrong direction, but eventually it will be very much of the legislator courage here. It's about legislators actually having the courage to represent the people as they were elected to do. And I think that remains to be seen, if they are able to do that. And if they are, then we probably can look forward to, well, many more debates, of course, but also free and open future.
بهره برداری امن از موبایل و اینترنت، زن، حقوق فردی و اجتماعی، سازوکارهای جلوگیری از نقض حقوق بشر، پویشی در مفهوم دموکراسی، مروری بر پایگیری نهادهای مدنی در ایران، اندیشه‌های نوین از حقوق کارگران، آموزش خبرنگاری، حقوق شهروندی امروز و محیط زیست. توانا، رایگان توانایی ما را به سمت انسان امروزین جهانی متمدن تازه می کند. برای شرکت در این کلاس ها به توانا.org بروید و با جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. از طریق فیسبوک، توییتر و شبکه یوتیوب می توانید آموزشکده توانا را دنبال کنید. توانا آموزشکده است برای جامعه مدنی ایران.